We had planned a peaceful weekend getaway. My fiancée, Emily, had discovered a listing online for a secluded cabin deep in the Washington forest. It wasn't fancy, but it had the basics: running water, electricity, and a wood stove to keep us warm on chilly nights. The photos showed a charming little spot surrounded by towering evergreens, an ideal escape from the chaos of city life. We both desperately needed it. Wedding preparations had consumed most of our free time, leaving us exhausted. A few days away from everything sounded like the perfect reset. The drive to the cabin took longer than anticipated. The directions from the owner were straightforward, but the gravel road leading there was rough, narrow, and twisted through the dense forest. My aging SUV barely managed the uneven terrain. The further we drove, the more remote it felt. We lost cell reception about 15 minutes before we arrived. By the time we pulled into the clearing, the late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows. The cabin was smaller than I had pictured, but it matched the photos. Wood-paneled walls, a small porch with two mismatched chairs, and a little chimney poking through the roof. Emily stepped out of the car, stretching and glancing around. The silence was almost unnerving. No traffic, no chatter, not even a faint hum of distant machinery, just the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. We unpacked our bags and carried them inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dampness, though it wasn't unpleasant. The main room had a simple couch, a tiny kitchen setup, and a small table with two chairs. There was a separate bedroom and a compact bathroom, both clean though snug. Next to the wood stove, there was a neat stack of firewood and a note from the owner reminding us to secure the doors at night due to bear sightings in the area. It was nearly dark by the time we settled in. Emily lit a few candles while I started the fire. That evening, we planned to keep it simple, make dinner and relax. The cabin's old radio managed to pick up a couple of stations, though the signal kept cutting out. We turned it off and let the crackling fire and the stillness outside serve as our background noise. The first night passed quietly, though I didn't sleep as well as I'd hoped. The silence felt too dense, almost unnatural. Every creak of the cabin made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was just my nerves. I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. The next morning, we decided to explore. The cabin's map highlighted a few nearby trails, including one leading to a lake about 3 miles away. We packed snacks and water, then set off. The trail was narrow but marked well, winding through dense woods that seemed endless. The crisp air carried the scent of pine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a bit of my tension melt away. It was just the two of us, the forest, and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the dirt. The lake was breathtaking, a flawless mirror reflecting the sky and trees around it. We sat by the water, snacking and chatting about wedding plans. It was the first time in weeks we felt like we could truly breathe. But as we began the hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Nothing specific, no unusual sounds or movement, but the forest felt subtly different, as though it was watching us. I kept my thoughts to myself, not wanting to worry Emily. When we returned to the cabin, something seemed out of place. One of the chairs on the porch was slightly askew, as if it had been moved. I was certain they had been aligned perfectly when we arrived. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of disturbance, but found none. Maybe I just hadn't noticed the chair's position before. That night, things took a darker turn. As we played cards by the fire, we heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, just outside. My chest tightened as Emily froze, her eyes wide. The sound came again, this time closer. I moved cautiously to the window, peering out. The porch light illuminated a small patch of the clearing, but beyond that, there was only darkness. I saw nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but unease gripped me. I I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked. Emily suggested turning in early, though neither of us got much sleep. Every creak or rustle outside made my pulse race. The next morning, I found something chilling near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Human ones. Faint but unmistakable. Someone had been standing there watching the cabin. I didn't tell Emily, not wanting to alarm her, but the discovery gnawed at me. We spent the day indoors, keeping the doors locked. Emily read while I sat by the window, trying to convince myself the prints were old, maybe left by a hiker or the cabin's owner. But deep down, I knew they weren't. That night was worse. Around midnight, the crunching started again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. It stopped by the bedroom window. Emily gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. She had heard it too. I wanted to grab a flashlight and check, but fear rooted me in place. What if someone was waiting for me to make a move? Eventually, the sound faded, but neither of us slept. At dawn, I went outside to investigate. More footprints. This time, they were closer, leading around the side of the cabin and into the woods. I couldn't ignore it any longer. We needed to leave. We hastily packed our things and drove off. The gravel road felt endless, but relief washed over me when we finally reached the highway. We never talked about that weekend again. Emily refused to bring it up, and I didn't press her. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Someone had been out there watching, waiting, and the thought that haunted me most, they had been close enough to touch us if they'd wanted to. I was 27 when it happened. I remember the exact year because it was 2013, and I had just gotten a promotion at my job. To celebrate, I rented a secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, a spot I thought would be the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. I'd been living in Asheville for a few years, and while I loved the energy of the town, the thought of spending a week surrounded by nothing but nature, fresh air, and quiet was irresistible. The cabin was described as rustic yet cozy. It was small, just a single-bedroom structure, but it had the essentials: running water, electricity, and even a wood-burning stove for warmth. The listing emphasized its isolation, which was exactly what I was looking for. It was about 8 miles from the closest paved road and surrounded by dense woodland. The idea of complete solitude thrilled me. I didn't tell many people about my trip, just packed my car with supplies and set off early on a Sunday morning. The drive to the cabin was breathtaking. The gravel road wound through endless forests of oak and pine, with occasional glimpses of distant peaks dusted with snow. My GPS signal came and went, but the directions provided by the property owner were easy enough to follow. By early afternoon, I arrived. The cabin was exactly as advertised, a weathered wooden structure nestled in a clearing. The trees were so dense around it that they felt like they were pressing in on all sides. A small porch with 2 wobbly chairs overlooked a fire pit a few yards away. The place looked old but sturdy, and a thrill of excitement ran through me as I unloaded my car. Inside, the cabin was snug but minimal. The main room functioned as both the living area and kitchen, with a small wood stove in one corner and an old couch pushed against the wall. A short hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The kitchen had basic utensils, and the fridge buzzed softly when I plugged it in. I unpacked my food, lit a few candles to set the mood, and settled in. That first evening was serene. I built a fire in the pit outside and cooked a simple dinner as the sun set behind the trees. As darkness fell, the silence deepened. It wasn't just quiet. It was an all-encompassing stillness, almost alive in its intensity. I brushed it off as my urban ears adjusting to the wilderness. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The mattress was uneven, and the sheets smelled faintly of dampness. The cabin creaked occasionally, as old places do, but beyond that, there was an eerie absence of sound. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. At some point, I drifted off, only to wake up suddenly in the middle of the night. The clock on the nightstand read 3:11 a.m. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the curtains. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping outside.
Top, top, top.
It was coming from the rear of the cabin, near the bedroom window. My first thought was a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving the silence heavier than ever. I stayed frozen, straining to hear anything else. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a pine cone falling or an animal passing by. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though it was fitful. The next morning, I shook off the unease from the night before and spent the day exploring the forest around the cabin. The trails were narrow but beautiful, winding through dense woods. The cool, crisp air helped ease my nerves, and by the time I returned in the late afternoon, I felt more relaxed. That evening, I built another fire and sat outside until the stars appeared. The tapping from the previous night felt like a distant memory, a trick of the imagination. But as I was finishing dinner, I heard a new sound, a faint crunching coming from the woods. It was subtle, but rhythmic, like footsteps on dried leaves. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening intently. The sound stopped abruptly. I scanned the tree line, but the darkness revealed nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but I felt exposed sitting there in the open. I gathered my things and went inside, locking the door behind me. I double-checked the windows to make sure they were secure. That night, I woke up again around 3 a.m., the same unease washing over me. Then I heard it, the tapping.
Top, top, top.
This time, it was louder and more insistent, coming from the same spot by the bedroom window. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were the trees. Nothing moved. The tapping had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found faint footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were barely visible, but they were their bare, human-like prints leading from the woods to the back of the cabin before disappearing. My stomach churned as I crouched to examine them. I tried to convince myself they were a trick of the light or my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The rest of the day, I was on edge. Every rustling leaf, every snapped twig set my nerves on high alert. By nightfall, I was exhausted and decided to forego the fire. I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and kept a knife by my side as I sat on the couch. That night, the tapping came again, more insistent than before. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the flashlight, I flung open the door and shone the beam outside. The yard was empty, the forest silent and oppressive. I stayed out there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the trees. Eventually, I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. By the fourth night, I was done. My week-long escape had turned into a nightmare. I planned to leave at dawn, but at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the cabin door creaking open. Someone or something was inside. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway, moving toward the bedroom. I grabbed the flashlight and knife, threw open the bedroom window, and scrambled outside. The cold air stung my skin as I hit the ground running. I jumped into my car, started it, and sped away without looking back. When I reached the nearest town, I reported the incident to the property owner and local authorities, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. To this day, I don't know what was out there, but I'll never forget those footsteps or the way the cabin seemed to watch me. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat turned into a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I never imagined I'd spend a week by myself in a secluded cabin in the Italian countryside. It wasn't my first pick for a holiday, but after months of being overwhelmed by work, I needed to unplug. A friend of mine, Lucas, had suggested his family's cabin, which was tucked away in the hills. "You'll appreciate it," he assured me. "No neighbors for kilometers, no internet, no interruptions, just peace and nature." At first, the idea sounded like exactly what I needed. A chance to unwind, clear my thoughts, and escape the city's chaos. Lucas gave me directions and warned me that the cabin was old but serviceable. "Just pack enough for the week," he said. On a chilly morning in early November, I filled a rental car with groceries, clothes, and a stack of novels, then drove toward the countryside. The journey was calm, winding through quaint villages and sprawling fields. But as I approached the cabin, the road narrowed and became bumpier. The trees around me grew denser and taller, their shadows making the late afternoon feel like twilight. When I finally arrived, a shiver of unease swept over me. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. It was a modest structure of weathered timber, with a sloped roof and a tiny porch. Not another building or sign of life could be seen, just the cabin and the woods encircling it like a fortress. Inside, the cabin was exactly as Lucas described, basic but functional. It had a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom with a squeaky metal bed frame. There was no electricity, only a few oil lamps and a stack of firewood beside the hearth. The quiet was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional rustling leaves or the faint chirp of a bird. On my first day, I unpacked, prepared a simple meal, and read by lamplight. By the time I crawled into bed, I was already second-guessing my decision. The isolation was more profound than I'd anticipated, and every creak of the cabin or sound outside made me tense. The next morning, I decided to explore. A narrow path behind the cabin led deeper into the woods. The air was sharp and cold, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on the trail and the occasional snap of a branch. After about an hour, I stumbled across an old, moss-covered fence. Beyond it lay what appeared to be a dilapidated barn. Its roof had caved in, and its windows were shattered. Something about the sight unsettled me. Unable to pinpoint why, I decided not to investigate further. On my way back, I had the eerie sensation of being watched. The forest seemed darker, quieter, and I occasionally thought I heard soft footsteps behind me. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and tried to shake off the creeping paranoia. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I split firewood and read, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. That night, I woke up to a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was so gentle it could have been mistaken for a knock. I froze, heart pounding, and strained to hear more. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence. In the morning, I checked outside but found nothing out of place. No tracks, no signs of an animal. I convinced myself it was just a tree branch brushing against the cabin. But later, I started noticing strange things. A chair in the kitchen wasn't where I'd left it. A book on the table had moved. At first, I blamed myself, assuming I'd forgotten. But as these incidents continued, I began doubting that explanation. By the fourth night, my nerves were shot. The tapping had returned the previous evening, louder and more deliberate. I barely slept and jumped at every sound. The next day, I went for a short walk to calm my nerves. But when I came back, the front door was slightly open. I was certain I'd locked it, though the interior appeared undisturbed. The feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. I sat in the living room with a knife in hand, staring at the door. When the tapping started again, this time at the window, I didn't move. I barely breathed. The noise eventually stopped, but I felt no relief. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I hastily packed my belongings and loaded the car. But when I turned the key, the engine refused to start. The battery was dead. Trapped, I spent the day barricading the cabin with whatever I could find, preparing for the night ahead. When darkness fell, I lit every oil lamp and candle, sitting in the corner with my knife. The tapping returned, but this time it came from everywhere, on the walls, the roof, even the door. It was as if something was testing the cabin's defenses, encircling it. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. For what felt like hours, there was silence. But just when I began to think it was over, the door handle began to turn. I never saw who or what was out there that night. At dawn, I discovered the car's battery cable had been deliberately cut. After fixing it, I drove away and never looked back. I sold everything from that trip, the clothes, the books, even the car. I haven't spoken to anyone about what happened in detail, and I doubt I ever will. I only hope I'll never have to experience anything like that again. I rented the cabin on a whim. It was 2021, and I had just quit a high-pressure job in Austin, Texas. I desperately needed a break from my routine, from work, from people. I craved solitude and figured the secluded forests near the New Mexico-Arizona border would be the ideal escape to clear my mind. The listing described the cabin as completely off the grid, no power, no plumbing, but I didn't care. The photos showed a charming wooden structure nestled among dense trees, far removed from the chaos of civilization. Perfect. The owner assured me it was safe and mentioned that there wasn't much nearby, just wilderness. That was exactly what I was after. I packed enough for a week: canned food, a camping stove, extra clothes, and a solar-powered charger. I also brought along a small handgun I'd recently purchased after moving to Texas. I wasn't overly worried, but being completely alone in the middle of nowhere made it feel like a good precaution. The drive was nearly 7 hours. As I got closer, paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, I hadn't passed another car in over an hour. The cabin looked just like the photos: small, rustic, and tucked away in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There was no driveway, just a patch of flattened dirt where I parked my truck. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, explored the immediate area, and spent the evening reading by the light of a battery-powered lantern. It was eerily quiet. No traffic noise, no distant hum of anything man-made. Just the wind weaving through the trees and the occasional sound of wildlife. That night, I slept deeply despite the strange sensation of being so utterly cut off. The second day, I decided to go for a longer hike into the woods. I packed water and snacks into a small bag and marked my trail with strips of neon tape to ensure I wouldn't lose my way. The forest was stunning but incredibly dense. It was easy to see how someone unfamiliar with the terrain could quickly get disoriented. After about 2 hours of walking, I stumbled across something strange. A faint path not marked on any maps I'd reviewed. The trail was overgrown, but it looked like it had been used fairly recently. Intrigued, I decided to follow it. The path led me to a small clearing. In the middle sat an old, abandoned camper. It looked like it had been there for years. The tires were completely flat, and rust covered most of the exterior. Trash was scattered around the area. Empty cans, shredded clothes, broken furniture. It made my skin crawl. Something about the scene felt wrong, as if I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't stick around long. I retraced my steps and headed back to the cabin, trying to shake off the unsettling vibe. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept imagining someone or something watching me from the woods. The wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan. At one point, I was certain I heard footsteps near the cabin, but when I mustered the courage to look outside, there was no one there. By the third day, the isolation that had initially felt so freeing had become oppressive. I decided to stay close to the cabin and spent the day chopping wood and reading to distract myself. Around midday, I noticed something odd. One of the neon tape markers I'd used during my hike had been tied to a tree near the cabin. I hadn't put it there. At first, I thought I must have been mistaken, but when I checked, I realized it was one of the markers I'd placed on the trail leading to the camper. Someone had moved it. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Was someone else out here? Why would they do that? I tried to convince myself it was a hiker or a hunter, someone who thought the tape was litter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I kept my gun within arm's reach for the rest of the day and double-checked that all doors and windows were locked before nightfall. That night, I woke to a loud, violent banging on the cabin. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to break the door down. Heart racing, I grabbed my gun and shouted. The noise stopped. After several tense minutes, I looked outside, but there was no one there. The next morning, I discovered deep, jagged scratches on the front door, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it. Worse, the tires on my truck had been slashed. I was effectively trapped with no phone signal to call for help. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could have been animals or bad luck with the tires. But then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. Human footprints. Panic took over. I packed essentials, food, water, and my gun, and decided to hike to the nearest ranger station, about 12 miles away. As I moved through the forest, I felt eyes on me. Every rustle or snap of a twig made me whip around, gun raised. Then I saw him, a man standing motionless among the trees just off the trail. He was dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled low over his face. He didn't move. He just stared at me. I froze, heart hammering. I shouted at him to stay back, pointing my gun. He didn't react, not a flinch. Terrified, I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. I burst inside, breathless and shaking, and told the ranger everything. The cabin, the footprints, the man in the woods. He listened and then told me something chilling. There had been reports of drug traffickers using cabins in the area as stash points. Occasionally, people renting them stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. He drove me back to retrieve my belongings. When we arrived, the cabin had been ransacked. The door was broken, my supplies gone. I never returned to that area. To this day, I don't know exactly what I walked into, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, hunted. Now, whenever I think about renting a remote cabin, I always wonder who or what might already be out there. It was late September, and the air was turning crisp. I had been longing for some time away from the hustle and constant noise of my everyday life. A weekend trip to a secluded mountain cabin seemed like the perfect escape. After some searching online, I found a small cabin that looked both quaint and inviting. It was tucked deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, far removed from any towns or well-worn trails. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin sitting on a hill, offering a stunning view of the forest. There were no nearby neighbors, just miles of trees and silence. The drive there took longer than anticipated. The winding mountain roads twisted sharply, and as I ascended higher, the weather began to shift. By the time I reached the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the air was damp with the chill that often precedes rain. The path was rough, littered with fallen leaves and patches of mud. My car, an older compact sedan, wasn't ideal for such rugged terrain and struggled through some of the deeper ruts. But after some effort, I finally arrived. The cabin was smaller than I had pictured, but it had a certain rustic charm. It was a single-room structure with a small bed, a kitchenette, and a wood stove nestled in one corner. Outside, a wooden porch held 2 weathered chairs, overlooking a valley of dense trees. I unpacked quickly, eager to beat the rain, and hurried inside. Just as I lit a fire in the stove, the first drops began pattering against the roof. At first, the sound of the rain was soothing, a rhythmic tapping on the windows and roof. I had brought along a book and a few supplies, anticipating a quiet, peaceful evening. The fire crackled warmly as the rain intensified, and for a time, I felt completely at ease. But as the hours passed, the downpour turned torrential, and the wind began to howl, rattling the cabin. The cozy atmosphere I had enjoyed earlier started to shift into something more unsettling. It wasn't fear exactly, but an uneasy feeling crept in as the storm grew louder. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. Around 9:30 p.m., the power cut out, just as the owner had warned me might happen during bad weather. Thankfully, I had brought a flashlight and a few candles. I lit the candles and placed them on the table near the bed, their flickering light casting strange shadows across the cabin walls. The storm raged on. The rain hammered relentlessly, and the wind whistled as it bent the trees outside. Then I heard something, a sound distinct from the storm. It was faint at first, like a soft knock or a thud, but it felt out of place. I told myself it was likely a branch falling or something blowing against the cabin, but then it happened again, this time louder and more deliberate. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and directed its beam toward the door. Nothing. I stood motionless, listening intently. When the sound didn't repeat, I convinced myself it was my imagination or the storm playing tricks on me. I returned to the bed, though I could no longer focus on my book. Minutes later, there it was again. 3 distinct knocks, this time coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. There was no back door, only a small window overlooking the slope behind the hill. Whatever or whoever was making the noise had to be right against the wall outside. I froze, my thoughts racing. Who would be out here in the middle of a storm? The nearest town was at least an hour away, and there were no other cabins nearby. The idea of someone wandering through the woods in such weather seemed impossible. I reached for my phone, but as I expected, there was no signal. Frustration and fear surged through me as I cursed myself for not being better prepared. The knocking stopped, but my nerves remained on edge. I kept the flashlight nearby and stayed close to the fire, its glow illuminating much of the room. The storm drowned out all other sounds, making it impossible to tell if anyone, or anything, was moving outside. An hour passed, maybe longer. I started to think whoever had been out there was gone. Just as I began to relax, I heard something that chilled me to my core. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against wood. It was coming from the back window. The cabin's windows were old and thin, secured with flimsy latches. I shone the flashlight toward the back, but I saw nothing. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone was trying to pry the window open. Panic gripped me as I grabbed the stove poker for defense, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. Then, suddenly, the scraping stopped, replaced by silence. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, but that relief shattered as the glass in the back window exploded inward. Shards flew across the room, and the icy wind howled through the opening. I aimed the flashlight at the window, expecting to see someone forcing their way in, but there was no one there. Nothing, just shattered glass and rain pouring inside. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but stepping outside into the storm seemed equally dangerous. In desperation, I barricaded the broken window with a small table and chairs, hoping it would delay whoever or whatever was trying to enter. I spent the rest of the night by the stove, clutching the poker and flashlight, flinching at every noise the storm brought. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the forest eerily quiet. I hastily gathered my belongings and prepared to leave. As I walked around to inspect the damage, I noticed something that froze me in place. Footprints. Deep, fresh prints in the mud, leading away from the cabin and into the dense woods. I had always loved solitude, the kind where it's just you, a book, and the quiet murmur of nature all around. So, when I came across a remote lodge for rent in the Smoky Hills, I didn't hesitate. It was late spring 2021, and I was worn out from the grind of my office job. A week far from the city, disconnected from people, sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin sat about 12 miles off a narrow back road, down a winding dirt trail that snaked through thick woods. There was no phone reception and no nearby houses, which was precisely what I'd hoped for. The rental ad had described it as rustic, which I took to mean old but functional. I wasn't after luxury, just peace and quiet. I arrived in the early evening as the sun dipped low, painting the trees in golden light. My car crunched into a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was modest, perhaps 650 square feet, with weathered wood siding and a tin roof dotted with rust. A wraparound porch framed the front, complete with a creaky swing and a couple of rickety chairs. Cozy enough. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of aged timber and dust. The furnishings were basic: a small couch, a wooden table, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchenette with only the essentials. Down a narrow hallway, there was one bedroom and a bathroom with a shower but no bathtub. A few shelves held old paperbacks and some faded board games. The curtains, fraying at the edges, looked like they hadn't been touched since the early 90s. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. After stacking some logs in the stove and cracking open a drink, I sank into the porch swing and watched the sun sink behind the trees. The forest came alive with sounds: birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional sharp snap of a branch. Felt good to be disconnected, peaceful. That first night, I slept like a log. The following morning, I decided to explore the woods surrounding the cabin. There wasn't much of a trail, just a faint path likely worn by deer or other animals. Towering pines and oaks formed a dense canopy, letting only slivers of sunlight through. The air was damp and cool, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. I didn't wander far, maybe a mile or so. The last thing I wanted was to lose my way without cell service. On my way back, something unusual caught my eye. Just off the path, half hidden by brush, was a patch of disturbed soil. The earth looked fresher than the rest, as though it had been recently dug and then filled back in. There were no markers or signs to suggest anything significant, but I couldn't help staring at it. Probably just an animal digging, I thought, but the more I looked, the stranger it felt. The dirt wasn't just dug up. It seemed deliberately packed down, like someone had buried something. Uneasy, I brushed it off and continued back to the cabin, determined not to let my imagination ruin the trip. The afternoon passed quickly. I read for a while, chopped some firewood, and soon the sun was setting again. But the image of that disturbed patch of ground lingered in my mind. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere digging a hole? That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the spot in the woods. Eventually, my curiosity won out. Just past midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and a small camping shovel I'd brought with me, telling myself I'd dig just a little, enough to ease my mind. The forest at night was a different world. The cheerful chirps of birds were replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the eerie rustle of leaves. My flashlight cast long, shifting shadows, and every step seemed unnaturally loud. It took longer than I expected to find the spot again, but eventually, I did. Under the flashlight's beam, the dirt looked even more out of place. I hesitated, then began to dig. At first, it was just loose soil, but after a few minutes, my shovel hit something solid. My heart raced as I crouched down and brushed the dirt away with my hands. What I uncovered made my stomach churn. It was a hand, pale and lifeless, poking up from the earth like some grim warning. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to run, but something stopped me. I had to see more. With trembling hands, I kept digging. In minutes, I had uncovered a body. It was a man, perhaps in his late 30s, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. His face was partly decayed, but it was clear he hadn't been buried long. The stench hit me, a sickly, nauseating odor that made me gag. I staggered back, my mind racing. Who was he? How did he end up here? And most terrifying of all, who buried him? Grabbing my flashlight, I bolted back to the cabin, heart pounding. Inside, I locked the door and shoved a chair beneath the handle for good measure. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, my thoughts spiraling. What if the person who buried him was still out there? What if they'd seen me? At first light, I made my decision. I had to leave. I packed my belongings in record time and loaded them into my car. But as I grabbed the last bag, I froze. On the porch swing sat a boot. A single boot identical to the ones the man in the ground had been wearing. My blood turned to ice. Someone had been there while I was inside. I didn't wait to find out who. I jumped into my car, started it up, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the main highway. Once I had cell service, I called the authorities and reported what I'd found. They took me seriously, but I never heard back about what they discovered. I've never returned to that cabin. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching me that night. Someone who didn't want their secret uncovered. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still smell that sickly sweet odor. This happened in Montana during the late 80s when I was around 16 years old, in the middle of winter. My family and I lived in a small cabin surrounded by dense forest. By deep in the forest, I mean the nearest neighbor or store was at least a 40-minute drive away. It was around 9:30 at night. My dad worked late-night shifts, so it was just my mom and me at home. Everything seemed normal until things took a terrifying turn. We had just finished eating dinner, and my mom was clearing the table. She asked me to take care of the dishes, so I got to work. I turned on the tap, waiting for the cold water to heat up, when I noticed the outdoor porch light went out. The reflection in the window, combined with the sudden darkness outside, made it difficult to see. But then I caught sight of something, a face. Someone or something was outside, staring straight at me. I froze in place, completely stunned. I grabbed a towel to wipe the condensation off the window, hoping for a better look. As soon as I cleared the glass, an intense, blinding light shone directly at me. The brightness made me squint and turn my head away for a moment. When the light switched off, I saw a figure standing farther back but still watching me. Before I could react, my mom placed the last of the dishes in the sink, snapping me out of my daze. She noticed my pale expression and asked what was wrong. I told her there was someone outside, staring at me and shining a flashlight into the window. At first, she didn't believe me, assuming I was joking. I tried convincing her I was serious, confused about how she hadn't noticed the flashlight since it was so bright. She guessed she must have had her back turned at the time. When I felt brave enough, I stepped back to the window to check again. The figure was gone. I felt a slight sense of relief, but that didn't last long. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently, as though someone was trying to turn it and get inside. My mom screamed, and we both grabbed small kitchen knives. Whoever was outside began pulling harder on the door and kicking it forcefully. It was clear they were attempting to break in. Luckily for us, my dad arrived at that exact moment. His shift had been cut short unexpectedly, and he came home earlier than usual. If he hadn't, I don't think my mom and I would have survived that night. As soon as my dad pulled into the driveway, the intruder bolted. But my dad wasn't about to let him get away. He took out his Glock and fired 5 times, hitting the man with every shot. The man collapsed and died within minutes. Once the situation was under control, my dad drove us to the local police station to report what had happened. Thankfully, he faced no charges. The authorities confirmed it was self-defense. When the police arrived at the scene, they found a handgun tucked into the intruder's waistband, along with a sharp 6-inch knife, mace, and a pair of handcuffs. I shudder to think about what his intentions might have been. I'm just grateful my dad showed up when he did and protected us. A few months later, we moved out of that cabin and into a new house my dad and his friends built for us. I lived there for 6 years before moving in with my girlfriend to an apartment in the city. Life has been pretty calm since then, but this is a story I find myself sharing now and then. It's a memory that still haunts me, yet I'm forever thankful for how it ended. This happened when I was 14 years old, a little over 4 years ago. My friend and I used to play hide and seek outside at night in the dark. We could hide almost anywhere we wanted, and there weren't many restrictions on where we could go. Even so, we usually didn't stray too far, as neither of us felt the need to. One particular evening, my friend Ethan was the seeker, and it was my turn to hide. I decided to make things more exciting and ran into the nearby woods. I figured it would add a twist to the game since we had never included the forest as part of our playing area before. Plus, I thought it would make it much harder for him to find me. As I searched for a hiding spot, I stumbled upon an old, weathered cabin that looked like no one had lived in it for years. When I got closer, I noticed that the front door was wide open. That struck me as odd, but curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously stepped inside. I wasn't completely sure if the cabin was empty, so I moved carefully, keeping quiet. Despite its abandoned appearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be inside. I eventually found my way to one of the rooms and decided to wait there. After about 10 minutes, boredom set in. I hadn't really considered how dull it would be to hide somewhere so well. Just as I was thinking about leaving or finding a different spot, I peeked out the window. That's when I noticed a dark figure moving in my direction. I wasn't sure if Ethan had spotted me, but to be safe, I ducked beneath the window. My heart raced as I held my breath, trying not to make even the slightest sound. The footsteps outside grew louder with every step, the crunch of leaves and twigs becoming clearer as the person approached. Soon, it sounded like they were right next to the window. Out of nowhere, there was a loud pounding on the glass. The sound was so sudden and intense that I almost screamed. My heart jumped into my throat, and I couldn't help but feel irritated, thinking Ethan was trying to scare me. The banging continued, 4 or 5 loud knocks. But when I finally peeked up, whoever had been there was gone. Frustrated, I started yelling Ethan's name, telling him that his prank wasn't funny. But then I heard the front door slam open, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps coming toward the room I was in. That's when I began to panic. I was positive I had closed the front door when I entered, so the fact that it was now open chilled me to the core. The footsteps echoed loudly on the wooden floor, and with each step, they grew closer and closer. I couldn't shake the creeping fear that whoever was in the cabin wasn't Ethan. I glanced out the window again and saw someone holding a flashlight. It was at that moment I realized the horrifying truth. The person in the cabin wasn't my friend because Ethan was standing outside, pointing his flashlight toward me. Without hesitation, I pushed the window open and leapt out, not caring how I landed. Thankfully, I hit the ground on my feet and didn't hurt myself. Ethan shone his flashlight on me, his face filled with confusion as I shouted for him to follow me. I didn't wait. I sprinted toward home, yelling over my shoulder about a man being inside the cabin. At first, Ethan thought I was joking. He stayed put for a moment, but then he saw the man for himself. The stranger was standing by the window I had just jumped from, staring out at Ethan. That's when Ethan finally believed me, and he ran after me. When we got back to my house, I explained everything that had happened. We didn't tell my parents about it, though, because I knew I was technically in the wrong for going into the cabin in the first place. I was just relieved nothing worse had happened. Ethan and I both agreed never to do anything like that again. I learned my lesson that night and have avoided taking unnecessary risks ever since. Looking back, I feel incredibly lucky to have made it out of that situation unharmed. One evening, during a late-night stroll, I happened across a trail I had never seen before. I often take walks mostly around the neighborhood, but occasionally I like to wander into unfamiliar areas. A few miles from my home, there's a park I enjoy visiting. It's a sprawling area with paths I likely haven't even discovered yet. While walking there one evening, I noticed the entrance to a trail I didn't recognize. It immediately caught my attention. Without much thought, I found myself stepping onto this new path. It was early in the evening, probably just past 6. Because it wasn't too late, I didn't intend to go far. The park had hours, and I didn't want to get stuck out there after dark. As I ventured deeper, I began to drift off the marked trail, exploring unfamiliar territory. After walking for what felt like a mile, I decided it was best to turn back. The daylight was fading quickly, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. Just as I was about to retrace my steps, I spotted a small structure in the distance to my left. It was a cabin. Something compelled me to take a closer look, though I couldn't explain why. I felt curious, even though part of me thought I should leave. This park isn't a camping ground or anything like that. It's just a public recreational area. I'd been visiting since childhood and never imagined a cabin could be hidden out here. It looked dilapidated, as if no one had maintained it for years. I kept my distance, staying about 20 feet away as I circled the structure. I didn't want to risk startling anyone who might be inside. Suddenly, a loud banging noise broke the silence, as though someone was pounding on something. Startled, I almost bolted but decided instead to move cautiously toward the source of the noise. Rounding the cabin, I noticed a girl close to my age trapped in the basement. She was pounding on the window and screaming for help. Her words were muffled, but I understood enough to know something was terribly wrong. I ran to the window, trying to pry it open. She motioned for me to be quiet, placing a finger to her lips. The window wouldn't budge, and I realized I needed to act quickly. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Panicking, I used my phone's notes app to write a message and pressed it against the glass, asking if she was in danger. She nodded urgently. When I asked if anyone else was inside, she shrugged, unsure. I reassured her that I'd help her escape and moved around the cabin to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Frustrated and desperate, I scoured the woods for something to break the glass. After searching, I found a heavy stone. Returning to the basement window, I motioned for her to step back. I hurled the stone as hard as I could, shattering the glass. Though the window was broken, it was too small for her to climb through. Realizing I had no other choice, I broke a larger window on the side of the cabin and climbed inside. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen as a precaution and carefully checked every room. The cabin seemed empty. In the basement, I found the girl trapped in a small cage. She was barely clothed, covered in bruises and scars. Her injuries told a story of horrific abuse, physical, emotional, and worse. She described being starved, assaulted, and forced to take drugs like LSD and meth. I searched the basement for something to break the lock on her cage and found a sledgehammer. Using it, I pried the lock open and helped her out. She was so weak she could barely stand. I found some shoes by the door, helped her put them on, and supported her as we began the long walk to my car. As we reached the porch, headlights appeared in the distance. It was getting dark, but the girl, her name was Mia, said it might be the man who had imprisoned her. We moved as quickly as possible, staying out of sight. Somehow, we avoided being seen and escaped before the man reached the cabin. Eventually, we made it to my car. I drove Mia straight to the hospital, where she recounted everything to the police. I stayed with her until I knew she'd be okay. I never got a chance to give a formal statement to the authorities, and I don't know where Mia is now, but I hope she's found peace. This happened over 2 years ago, and it still haunts me. I sometimes wonder if the man who did this was ever caught, or if he's still out there, preying on others. At the time, my spouse and I were preparing to move out of state, so I never followed up. But I'll never forget that night or the horrors I uncovered in that cabin.